What is happening in Iran? Very excited to have this discussion today with Jonathan Schanzer. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
It's really good to have you. Jonathan is the executive director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I know that you previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury and did many other things, which I don't think we have to get into here. But safe to say that Jonathan has authored many, many books and is an absolute expert on, I would say, all things Middle East. Feel free to push back on that if you like, but I don't think that that is in any way inaccurate.
Most things Middle East. How about that?
Okay, there you go. So welcome. Jonathan, before we jump into Iran and what's happening there, can you just please tell us what is the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies?
Sure. We're a not-for-profit think tank based in Washington. We're about 100 people. We've been around for, almost 25 years. And we cover all things national security, foreign policy as it relates to the U.S. and its national interests. So a lot on the Middle East, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Israel, what we've watched over the last 2.5 years play out. But also we got experts on Russia, on China, military, sanctions. All the things that make our policy hopefully effective, but also all the threats that we face day in and day out. So we've got a lot of experts coming out of, I'm former Treasury, but we got former CIA, we got former White House, we got folks that used to work on the Hill, people that speak foreign languages, usually more than one, cultural experiences on the ground. So it's basically kind of a mirror image of what the U.S. government would look like if it was not mired in debilitating bureaucracy.
Well said. Well said. I can only imagine how busy you must be these days as the battle for democracy and Western civilization rages in a way that I never thought we would witness or experience in my lifetime. So very, very happy that you guys are out there doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's been a busy time.
So I'd like to jump right into the topic for today because there's probably quite a bit to cover here. Let me just ask the question this way. I think many people, even many well-meaning people that absolutely believe in Western civilization and freedom and democracy, don't know much about Iran, don't know its rich history and the fact that it for thousands of years was neither Arab nor Muslim. And so I'd love for you to kind of just take us through a brief history for our audience and then explain what has led up to what is happening today.
Sure. To sort of do this on one foot, the Persian nation, the Iranian nation goes back centuries, thousands of years, in fact. It was not Muslim. It was not Arab, as you suggest. There were, I think, at least 3 different empires that embodied the Persian nation. They conquered large swaths of the Middle East and beyond. It was not until the 7th century, in fact, that we began to see the sort of Arab and Muslim influences on Iran that we see today. What's interesting is if you talk to the average Iranian and you call them Arab, there would be nothing more insulting to them, even as the country embraces Islam as the Arabs do. But even then, there is this sense of being very distinct from the rest of the Middle East. And there has always been that sort of different flavor that we've seen in Iran. I would actually argue that the Turks are also similar in that way. People think of Turkey as an Arab state because it's also Muslim. They would also find it very offensive. So we've got unique culture, unique history. And I think to fast forward to where we are today, you need to understand that there was one earthquake that brought us to this very precarious moment where we stand at the moment. And that was 1979. For years leading up to 1979, you had a monarchy in Iran. It was beset with corruption and mismanagement and waste, even as the country discovered oil and began to produce it, began to fill its coffers, fill its treasury with huge amounts of Western money, but the mismanagement of the country was just too much for the people to bear. The Shah of Iran had essentially driven the country into the ground by the mid to late 1970s. He falls ill. He leaves the country, and that's when you see the rise of a theocratic regime, this radical cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini, as he was known. He takes over the country in 1979, and it immediately transforms from a secular country, again, a corrupt and run-down country, but it was secular, and it was pro-America, and it was pro-Israel, and it was Western-oriented. With Khomeini's rise, the country completely pivots in another direction. It becomes jihadist. It becomes Islamist. And over the years, the country has not just run itself into the ground, but it has exported its revolution, the Islamic Revolution of Iran. It's exported it all over the Middle East. And you can see the imprint of that through groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and the Muslim Brotherhood. In other words, all of these terrible forces that America has grappled with over the years, we find connective tissue back to the regime in Iran. Their creed, their motto is death to Israel, death to America. They hate the United States. They hate the West. They hate our way of life. And as a result, we've been on a collision course with the regime. We've seen moments where we've clashed. We've seen moments where the United States has tried to do outreach to entice the regime to become, a responsible nation that works with the United States economically. Those things have failed. And one gets a sense right now, and I'll let you guide the conversation, but we're at a really interesting crossroads where the U.S. and Iran may come to blows. And that is something that I think is a long time coming and yet shocking at the same time.
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm just thinking, and I'd like to also just go maybe one step further in the history to make it personal. And maybe if you don't mind describing what it was like to live in Iran as a Persian prior to 1979 versus what it looks like today, because there is unrest, as we know, all over the world. Here in the United States, I never would have thought we'd see the expansion and advancement of Islamism across Europe. And I think a lot of what has led up to that is not in entirely dissimilar to what you just described in Iran, in the sense that there is mass distrust for government. There is obviously an enormous amount of corruption governmentally and waste and things that are real problems that we have here in the Western world. And those things and that unrest are opening doors not dissimilar to what happened in Iran for disruption and so on and so forth. So I'd love for you to just paint a picture, just so people can understand and correlate that back at a very personal level of where this could potentially go for us and what it looked like in Iran before and after.
Sure. So, just the painting that brief portrait of what it looked like before and after. If you go back and look at, like Time Magazine, Time Life, whatever, you could see photos of women in Iran wearing bikinis, kind of go-go boots. And all these things that, really invoke, images of Western culture, liberal American culture, culturally speaking, right? They embraced everything about the West.
Freedom.
Absolutely. Freedom of expression, freedom of how you want to dress. It was, I guess, officially an Islamic country, but man, was it not the dominant force within the culture. And then, you have this regime change in 79, this revolution. And now, women are forced to go out wearing the, full covering. The religious police that will punish people. There's famously a Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, who was arrested in 2022, brought in for questioning, was beaten and killed because of her, pro-West attitudes, because of the way that she dressed. So you get a sense of the difference between the culture. Again, really a 180 as far as that shift that took place. And I don't think it was natural for the Iranian people. People talk about today that the Iranian people are pro-West, they're pro-America, they're pro-Israel. They are educated, they are proud, they think about their history in ways that I think other people don't. They see the long view of history. Many of them, and we're seeing it right now as people protest out in the streets, they would like to go back to what they had. Of course, you can never go home again. It doesn't mean that you can reconstruct what happened under the Shah and have it be exactly what it was, but they like the model of freedom and more liberalization. They are attracted to that, and they're unattracted to the regime that they have. Now, why do they find this regime so deplorable?
Before we do that, can I just ask one clarifying question?
Yeah.
Because there's some disagreement that you see online about this. When you say they are pro-freedom, they are anti-regime, what percentage, as an expert, would you say of Iranians are anti-regime, are pro-freedom, would like to, if they could, go back, even though it's impossible, or at least get to as close as they could to what it was pre-1979? What percentage are we talking about of Iranian population?
Right. So, first, let's just, before I give you that answer, just remember, this is a theocratic autocracy, right?
Right.
Zero freedom of speech, right? And so it's not like you're going to get like Pew polls calling you and asking you like, hey, do you like your regime? Press 1, right? That doesn't happen, right? And so, somebody calls and says, do you like your regime? Yes, I love the regime. It's great. I love it. Thank you. Bye, right? That's kind of what you're going to hear from people when the regime comes calling. But if you ask me, it's probably 80%, 90% oppose the regime. It's probably about 20% that is part of the regime. But let me just say, 50% of the country is like, they're minorities. And the minorities are treated poorly, right? Different religions, different ethnicities. And so you get a sense that the regime, it's a minority controlling the majority. And on top of that, it is brutal. It is not, and I think this is where you also need to understand, it's not necessarily only ideological at this point. And I think that needs to be understood as we watch these protests unfold inside Iran. The currency has collapsed, okay? Purchasing power of the rial is like, it's like 100, whatever it is, like a 1.3 million rial to the dollar, I think, right now. It's not good, right? There is a water shortage from mismanagement. There are electrical shortages, so people aren't getting power to their homes. And on top of that, there's the religious repression. There's the isolation out there in the world. There's what happens when you see people protest out into the streets and they start slaughtering people, which doesn't exactly endear the regime to its people. Officially, right now, after protests that have been going on since December 28th, the official number is like 3,600 deaths. The unofficial number is 16,500, okay? And I've heard that the number could be higher than that. So when you think about how the average Iranian views this regime, given its failings, given its repression, given the lack of opportunity, given the brutality, and by the way, the amount of money that this regime has spent trying to sow chaos outside of the country is also not lost on the people. So all the money that's gone to Hamas and Hezbollah and Shiite militias in Iraq and the Houthis and all these other terrorist groups that have been, bedeviling the United States and our allies for years, there is frustration. And you can see that frustration, and it's only growing right now, which makes this an historic moment in the region. We can talk about the history of the popular protests, and that may be instructive here right now, but man, are the Iranian people not happy, and for good reason.
So this is a regime that, we know hates the West, hates the United States, views it as the great Satan, chants death to Israel and death to America every day in their parliament. And not only do they say that only with words, but they back that up in all of the ways that you have just said. And they also, of course, inflict, these horrible injustices on their people. And I'm saying that in as simple and broad strokes as I can, just for our audience to get a picture of what's happening in Iran, and then also, as you said, their effect and impact on the globe. So, which does lead me to our next question. In your expert opinion, this could be a tough one. You hear a lot of talk about regime change, right? It's become this catchphrase here in the Western world. Should we want regime change, and should we work toward regime change in regions of the world where obviously it would benefit the populations of many of these countries that are living in conditions much like Iran? And yet, it seems the times that we have sort of gone after that have been very, very messy, right, historically. And therefore, it's very controversial here in the West. Should we even be meddling in this? Even if you put aside, well, I guess let's not put aside the impact that they have on the rest of the world, not only their own people. So, in your expert opinion, what would be the best outcome of these uprisings currently, and why?
Without question, regime change. I said it. And I get that it's a dirty term, but I think we overlearned the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. I really do. It's not to say that we should just go around and just bring down regimes one after the next and sow chaos around the world. But let me just say, we had justification for our invasion of Afghanistan and for wanting regime change. And by the way, do you know what country sponsored a huge amount of the terrorism that scuttled our efforts to bring about successful regime change in Afghanistan?
Let me guess.
Surprise. It was the Iranians, right? So they helped teach us the lesson that we shouldn't bring down regimes because they're so afraid of regime change. They knew that they were a target. The same goes for Iraq. Now, we can make the argument that our justification for going into Iraq in the first place, in retrospect, was not great. I get that. That said, the Iranians were responsible for a huge amount of the carnage that we saw in Iraq, right? They were the ones that were planting these IEDs and killing American soldiers and tearing off the limbs of our men and women in uniform. And so we overlearned the lessons there as well.
Can you explain a little bit more about that? And I'll tell you why. That's such a controversial thing, which is crazy that it is, right? Because I've just sort of understood that as fact. But here you've got people, even in our own country, Tucker Carlson's of the world, so on and so forth, saying they don't know anyone that was directly harmed by this regime, et cetera, which is absolutely ridiculous and absurd. But can you talk a little bit more about specifically how that happened so that we can understand when we say that Iran was responsible for all of the things that you just mentioned, how did that work? And if you have any numbers on, casualties and so on and so forth, that would be helpful just so we can get as specific as possible.
Yeah, I don't know offhand what the number is. I mean, I want to say it's in the low thousands of people killed and maimed by the regime.
And you're talking
that's
American soldiers.
American soldiers. And so when you look at, we have evidence of Iranian-backed militias targeting American troops, shooting down American drones, attacking American assets. By the way, taking the tech and replicating it when they're able to get it. And so we've seen the evidence of how they were there, what they were able to replicate. And I think that that's important because it's unequivocal evidence that they were there, right?
Right.
There are lawsuits that have been launched by American servicemen and their families, the survivors, where they have won in court seeking damages from the Islamic Republic of Iran. When you see the Shia militias in the southern part of Iraq, undeniably allied with the Islamic Republic, subservient to it in many ways. And we still hear about that to this day, that they take their orders from the regime, even though they're based inside Iraq. Al-Qaeda, it has been undeniable, it has been proven that the Iranian regime, actually even dating back to 9/11, some of the hijackers transited through Iran and received training there. That's been proven. But during the period of the insurgency in Iraq and the fights in Afghanistan, we saw evidence of Iranian fingerprints, the IEDs that were used, the ammunition that were used, the weapons platforms that were used. The Iranians have had their fingers in all of this. And that's why I think it really does. It's important for people to understand, look, yes, we did not do regime change well. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that our military is structured. We don't have experts in building regimes. These people are trained to blow things up and to kill enemies, not to build societies and to become teachers or to build wells and all hospitals and bridges. These are things that we don't do, right? I mean, we don't have one of our armed services of nation building, right? Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, etc. We don't have nation builders. So if we want to do that, we could think about it. But I think what's important to understand is even with our failings, the Iranian regime, not only the Iranian regime, of course, we know that the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they were all part of the attacks that we sustained, but the Iranian regime played a significant role here. And so when we talk about how we shouldn't change the regime in Iran because of these other experiences, my response is maybe we should bring down the regime in Iran because of those experiences, because the Iranians did all of this to us and to our allies, and we squandered blood and treasure and massive efforts, and we discredited ourselves on the world stage. The Iranians were laughing the entire time as they succeeded in scuttling our efforts. They have some comeuppance, and I'd like to see us deliver that.
You know, when you consider regime change, there are a lot of questions always that I feel seem to be common, and some objections. And one of the objections is always, well, you never know who's going to follow, who will be the successor to this regime, could be worse. And I think in its simplest form, one way to look at it is, isn't it always good to allow the possibility for regime change in the face of such evil, in the hopes that something better will come, and in an effort to allow that process and to allow the people of Iran to move into something, in the very least, just opening that door of opportunity would seem beneficial to me. I do want to ask, and I want to ask three questions, and maybe in reverse order, and those questions are, how would regime change directly benefit the people of Iran? But for our American audience, I think a lot of people today are at the point, because of the unrest, the political unrest, the waste, the corruption that we're seeing. Of course, many people in this country, in the United States, are less interested in engaging in foreign activities, I'm just going to say in general, of any kind, and investing American resources. And a lot of that, we could get into the philosophical reasons for that, and the lack of gratitude and the sense of entitlement that this generation has, the next generation, so on and so forth. We don't need to get into those philosophical reasons. If I'm simply looking at the situation as a whole, and in simplicity asking the question, how would regime change benefit me here in the United States? Can you answer that question in its simplest form?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the way that we have had to deploy across the Middle East since 1979, all the different conflicts, chaos, the ensuring the steady and affordable supply of oil, the support for our allies, the security of our vessels as they transit key waterways, the Iranian regime has been at the heart of every challenge that we have faced. Again, including, it's had its fingerprints in Al-Qaeda, the war that's raging right now across the Middle East since October 7th of 2023. Hamas is an Iranian proxy. Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. The Houthis are Iranian proxies. In other words, every time we see chaos, we can see it tracing back to the regime in Iran. Now, I get that there is a, let's call it a neo-isolationist trend in the United States. And I understand where it comes from on some level. We have people saying, look, we spent all this money in Iraq and Afghanistan and we don't want to do this again. Like, let's set aside that Iran was actually responsible for our failures there in part or in whole. Let's set that aside for a minute. I want to just broaden the aperture for a second, because I think what people fail to understand is that the American century that we have seen unfold since, let's just say, since World War I, if not maybe World War II, depending on where you want to count it. The American century, where we dominate the world stage, where we are the dominant superpower, has brought about unprecedented wealth, technological innovation, food security, health benefits, education. I mean, the world has never been as advanced and relatively peaceful. I don't want to say it's been perfect, right? But I mean, overall, the benefits of the US-led world order have been enormous. The moment that we step back from trying to shape the world is the moment that we cede ground to some of our adversaries, what we would call great power competition. I'm thinking here about the governments of China and Russia in particular. If you give them the ability to shape the world, to shape the tech that is emerging, artificial intelligence and the weaponization of it, I got to tell you, I fear for the next generations. I mean, I get that people will say, look, the United States, we're imperfect and they don't like our leadership, whether it's this leadership or the previous leadership before that and some of the decisions that we made. I get it. I will also say, though, in the same breath, we're not China and we're not Russia and we are not dictators. We're imperfect and we're still an experiment, if you will. Right? The Republic here has gone through lots of different iterations, but it's still the best that the world has to offer for now, and the strongest, especially when you compare us to the Brits or the French or the Germans. They don't have the power to do this. And until we find somebody else that's willing to take the baton from us and to ensure that the world order that we created remains relatively stable, I got to tell you something. I think we need to be trying to shape the world. And I look at Iran right now as, look, I don't want to overstate this, but this moment right now of having an opportunity to bring down the Islamic Republic, it has echoes of Ronald Reagan's bringing down of the Soviet Union. This malign, malevolent foreign power that was wreaking havoc around the world. Reagan brings them down and a new world order emerges. World order brought us decades of relative calm and definitely prosperity and advancement. I think there are echoes here that I do think that Americans need to be aware of.
That makes good sense. And I do want to drill down a layer on that. Now, you know, one thing that we've talked about recently on this podcast is just correlating sort of what's happening in the world. And I like to just try to use very simple and practical analogies as much as possible, because a lot of these things are extremely complex, extremely nuanced, not very easy for people to understand, including myself. And so the more simple we can get, the more helpful. And we've correlated what's happening globally to the game of chess, which in this case is a little bit ironic, right? Because if I'm not mistaken, that game was created by none other than the Persians.
Actually, true fact, it was actually developed it was invented in India, but it's now like the national game for the Iranians.
Okay.
But yeah,
well, there
yes,
you just
I take your
something.
point.
So I love chess, and the point is that you have two sides that are moving forward, essentially, without the opportunity, not in moments. In moments you can, of course, retreat one piece or another, but in general, you have two sides that are moving forward, each side desiring to win, and there's no way to actually stop the collision of these things. And that really is just the reality globally. We would love for that to not be the case, but it is just factual as far as you can see that. And I really like what you said, the moment that we stop trying to advance our cause, the cause of freedom and our value system, we stand to lose. And I think, again, we need to be more and more focusing. You don't hear a lot of discussion about values today. And I think just understanding the values upon which Western civilization was built, Western democracy, Judeo-Christian values, is really important for Americans to understand in this time. And understand that we are extremely fortunate here in the West to live in a society that gets to experience the results of those values. And then also understanding that the majority, or many, many people around the world, do not get to experience the life as we get to experience, the freedoms that we get to experience, all the things that you just mentioned. And of course, Iran is a great case study, because it wasn't long ago that they did experience something much more similar to what we have today.
Yeah. I actually want to say something. I had meant to respond earlier to one thing that you mentioned about the kind of protests that we're seeing here, the unrest, in Minnesota, the response to ICE, and some of the other kind of popular protest movements that we've seen around the world. First of all, I'm a fierce proponent of the First Amendment. I think people should be able to go out and protest for whatever they want to protest for. And I recognize that there is a global movement afoot for people that are looking for greater opportunities, economic or otherwise. And I see it as a global phenomenon. It's not only the U.S., but certainly we're seeing it in the U.S., and it's a response to, let's be honest, it's Trump policies that people are opposed to. And I respect that. I don't always agree, or I don't always disagree. But again, we should, I think, welcome people going out and expressing their discontent. What I think people need to understand is what is happening in Iran is very different. Very different. And the reason why is that this is a population that's been suffering under a regime since 1979. Okay, so nearly 50 years of oppression and deprivation and mistreatment, mismanagement. This is not your ICE protests of like a specific policy or some recent trend. This is the accumulation of significant grievance over time, the mismanagement of wealth, in fact, the exportation of wealth to terrorist groups abroad, to the detriment of the people at home who cannot express their views openly, that can be arrested without cause, that can be held against their will for years on end with no legal justification. This is the situation in Iran. And so I'm loath to conflate the two. But the other thing that I think is really important to point out here is, we've watched people respond to the war in the Middle East here in this country for the last 2.5 years. And they have been extremely concerned. I'm putting this in very mild terms, but they've been very concerned about the loss of life in Gaza, for example, and the lack of freedoms for the Gazan people, the self-determination of the people of Gaza. I am dumbstruck by the absolute crickets that I have seen, as you've got thousands of people coming out into the streets in Iran after 50 years of being held down, right? The boot on the neck of these people from the regime in Iran. And I got to say, no campus protests, no Hollywood pins and reels on Instagram or TikTok. The media in this country has been, present company excluded, right? But the media has been silent. The crickets overall, when you look at the righteousness of this cause, is astounding to me. And again, I separate this out from so many of the other things that we've been watching, social trends here in the United States, other wars abroad. This is the oppression of a proud nation that is rising up, deserves our support, and wow, the lack of response has been overwhelming.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well said. So, and I think it's important to note that, and a question to ask those in our audience, Gen Zers and just anyone here in the United States, would you trade? I think the notion of a corruption-free government is naive. Do you agree with that? Power corrupts, and we just know, I don't know that such thing has ever existed in entirety, and I believe it's an impossibility. But would you trade your corrupt government for an entire society that is no longer free? and still has a corrupt government and an even more corrupt government. And so I think people lead many times with just these very impractical notions that, oh, the government is so corrupt, so we need a different system completely, when instead of focusing on, oh, we have freedom in this country and we better do everything that we possibly can to protect that, preserve that, and fight for that, and hopefully bring it to other places on the planet. So I don't want to get down a whole rabbit trail there. I want to come back to something really quick, because I was asking about, if I'm an American and I'm considering this situation, what my perspective should be on this situation, what I should hope for in this situation. I want to just dial it down one more level to the very practical. If I'm living in a rural community in the United States or in a big city in the United States, what would some very practical changes, what could some potentially practical outcomes be for me and my family as an American living in a big city again or in a rural community, if this regime were to change and we would have a free Iran again?
Well, it's a good question. I think, number one, the deployments to the Middle East from our armed forces would very likely drop over time. It doesn't mean it would drop immediately, but I do think that with Iran not sponsoring terrorist organizations and creating mayhem across the Middle East, the likelihood of our deployments goes down significantly. You'll have an oil partner to trade with, and we could actually see the increase of oil flowing worldwide. And by the way, the shipping lanes that the Iranians have threatened, whether it's in the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, not having as much of a challenge there would actually mean a decrease in the price of oil, because the security costs are baked in. Iran would probably
which would mean lower gas prices.
Yeah, absolutely. Less pain at the pump, as they say, and that's a huge indicator in general for Americans' happiness as it relates to the economy.
Less need to extract our own fossil fuels here in the West, potentially, right?
Or less need to take over the government of Venezuela for a time, for example. But I digress, right? There is I think an overall picture of, getting an ally back, which, be nice to have one of those. The Iranian people, again, I think they're a very proud nation, Western leaning, embrace the United States. If we are successful in helping to bring down their oppressors, I think they would see us as friends for life. I don't think that's a small thing when you talk about the Middle East. I think that you could actually see peace start to break out amongst some of our other allies, normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. In other words, a broader improvement across the Middle East, which, again, I think would help us economically, fewer deployments militarily. So I see lots of potentially good things here. One thing I would just note, though, this idea of the binary between fighting corruption and bringing down corrupt regimes. Let me just say, as long as you have the freedom to contest corruption in your country, savor it, own it, lean into it. That's what makes America different from some of these other places.
Absolutely. I love it. So, okay, we're starting to wind down here a little bit. I want to bring this full circle just because much of our audience is very connected and interested in what's happening in Israel. And I want to circle back to some of the narratives that are flying around and tie this back to Israel, Iran. There are these claims that Israel is, in part or in full, depending on who you're talking to blame for what's happening right now, the unrest in Iran. And I'd love for you to just address that. And, I hear these reports of Israelis, whether it's Mossad or whoever, Israeli operatives, on the ground in Iran. Do you have any insight into any of that, or any perspective that you could share with us on Israeli involvement in this? And people can leave it to their own discretion on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. You should be asking yourself, is it good that there might be an ally or somebody else that's operating in this theater? So what are your thoughts there, Jonathan?
Sure. Look, I think when we talk about this, it's just important to understand that the Islamic Republic of Iran has been fighting Israel by proxy. In other words, fighting Israel to the last Arab for decades. Right? Since 1982, I guess was probably the first time, or 81 was the first time we saw Iranian proxies emerge and start fighting Israel. So the Iranians have been fighting Israel. They've been meddling in Israeli affairs and killing Israelis and attacking Israeli interests for decades. The Israelis are there in Iran, and they're finally in Iran. And so they're on the ground. They've got assets there. We know that back in 2018, for example, Mossad guys stole the nuclear archive to embarrass and expose the regime for its nuclear progress when it was lying about it. We have seen other assets on the ground, certainly during the war last year, the 12-day war in June of 2025. There was a drone manufacturing facility that the Israelis put on the ground. They built a bunch of drones on the ground and then deployed them to start the war. And now, more recently, you may have seen, but somebody hijacked the airwaves in Iran. They were broadcasting messages on behalf of the crown prince in exile, the son of the fallen Shah from 79, the one who was deposed. The Israelis may have been responsible for that. They may not have. We don't know. But few other countries, maybe with the exception of the United States, have the capability to do such a thing. But bottom line is they're there. I think the more that the Israelis can help bring down the regime from the inside and to hand the baton to the... I mean, I don't want to see the Israelis running the show. Quite frankly, I don't want to see the United States running the show. I'd like for there to be some kind of caretaker government for a time of Iranians who then pave the way for a transition that would hopefully ultimately lead to a more liberal, stable, dare I say, democratic regime in Iran. That's what I'd like to see. But if you ask me whether it's a problem that the Israelis are there, I have zero problem with it. They are doing what's been done to them, and they're finally getting into the fight, because for many years, you know, the way that the Israelis always described it is that Iran was this octopus, and it had all these tentacles that were reaching into Israel, whether by way of Gaza through Hamas, or by Lebanon by way of Hezbollah, or in Syria where the Assad regime was there, or Iraq, or the West Bank, or the Houthis. All these tentacles, right, were attacking the Israelis. And the Israelis kept fighting back by just going after each tentacle one at a time. And what they've decided to do is to go for the head of the octopus. They're trying to strike at the regime while it's weak. Maybe in part because of Israel's attacks over the summer. Whatever the case may be, you're seeing the Israelis finally on a counteroffensive. That chess analogy, Simeon, is exactly the way that I would look at it. The Israelis, for the longest time, were only playing a defensive game and they were losing pieces. Now they're on the offense and they actually have a chance of killing the king. And it's being aided greatly by the Iranian people, who are not doing this for Israel. They're not doing it for the United States. They're doing it for themselves. They have been out in the streets for years now. 2009, they were out in the streets protesting a rigged election. 2018, 2019, we saw smaller iterations of this. I mentioned the Mahsa Amini protests, the Kurdish woman who was killed. That sparked massive protests in 2022. So the people are doing this anyway, organically, because it is what they want to do. And the Israelis, I think, are giving it a little nudge. Maybe the United States is doing that too. I wouldn't be surprised if we learned that the Saudis are giving a little help. Maybe Azerbaijan. Yeah, I mean, there are other countries in the region that hate the regime because of what it's done to the Middle East, because it's what it's done to its own people, because it's what it's done to the world. So, yeah, I expect the Israelis are there. And I say, way to go, guys. Keep it up.
Okay, so I think you also answered one of my next questions, which I thought was going to be a difficult question, and it's if Israel is already operational and there on the ground and acting, is the United States already also there and acting? And then also, should, in your expert opinion, the United States intervene further?
Okay, this
Hard
is where
questions.
This is where it gets tricky, and obviously this is one man's opinion. I can't give you sort of a universal answer to all of this. It's always a judgment call. I do believe that the U.S. has assets on the ground there. I think my guess is that we're probably talking right now to maybe mid-level officials of the regime, trying to figure out whether there's, alternative leadership that would topple the current regime. You got to remember, you got a guy who's, Ali Khamenei is the current supreme leader. By the way, the fact that he calls himself supreme leader should give you a sense of what this regime is all about, right? And so there may be people who are lying in wait that have the potential to bring down this old fogey and bring about something different in Iran. And I would welcome it. I think we've got cyber assets that we can deploy. We probably have special forces there right now, given the fact that, we were about to strike the regime last week on Wednesday night. We had aircraft that were already in flight and we called them back. That would suggest to me that we had people there on the ground with lasers painting the targets that we were about to hit. So yes, I think we have folks there. Now, the question that I think everybody's asking right now is, Donald Trump paused. We don't know if he's decided against striking the regime, in forever, or whether this was just, gosh, we didn't have enough assets on the ground. There were concerns about a response, air defenses, whatever it is.
Or was there real movement? Was there a change? Did we find a potential successor? Who knows? But
maybe,
could be a lot of things.
Maybe. I mean,
what don't we know?
Yeah, I mean, the way Trump put it was, they were going to hang a bunch of people and then they didn't. Well, 16,500 deaths later, I'm not sure that gives me any warmth or comfort, right? But he made a decision, and I've been telling folks, this isn't the fog of war. This is the fog of Donald Trump. We don't know Trump's moves, why he makes them, why he doesn't make them. He is mercurial. He makes decisions, and he's not always clear about it. We don't have a definitive policy. That lack of policy, by the way, makes our enemies very nervous. And I actually don't always, I don't love, as a policy analyst, as someone who's trying to explain American foreign policy to people abroad or to people at home, man, am I confused. But
I don't envy you.
Right. But my confusion is also the confusion of the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians. And that's a good thing. So
that's part of the art of the deal, right? Isn't that part of the art of the deal, right?
Everybody's on tilt. That is the art of the deal. Everybody's on tilt, to borrow from a poker term. Nobody knows what's going on, and people are afraid of making that next move. If you ask me personally, I think that we ought to go in, we ought to drop another midnight hammer on the regime in Iran. I think we ought to try to dislodge the regime. I think the benefits that I talked about are enormous. Now, there could be real risk. We could have chaos that emerges as a result. We could have a disruption in the flow of oil for a time. We could have more chaos in the Middle East before it gets better. But let me just say that the primary agent for all of the insurrections that we faced around the region would have been dislodged. And I would say that when we look at what just happened in Venezuela, there is maybe something instructive there, right? What we do is we do something dramatic. We take out Maduro, right? We capture him. We bring him to Brooklyn, which, by the way, there is some poetry there about bringing anyway, that's another podcast for another time. But at any rate, and now everybody's freaking out in Venezuela. And so what we've basically done is we started messaging to the vice president and to others within the regime. Here's the deal. If you don't want this to happen to you, if you want to stay in power, here are the new rules. And the question is, can we do that after having taken out the supreme leader, after having taken out the IRGC and the Basij and some of these other instruments of repression that have been holding the people of Iran down for almost 50 years? Can we do something similar there that doesn't involve thousands of American troops on the ground and the squandering of huge amounts of money from the U.S. Treasury? Like, in other words, kind of a surgical, deadly strike that would set the regime back and put our allies in a position to walk away with more freedom, more prosperity, and more stability. By the way, I do not have any inside information. I've not been in the room. I can't tell you what our plans are, but if we have a plan that's anything like what I've just described, more please. Faster.
Yeah, why wouldn't we do it? Why wouldn't we?
That's my take. Now, there are going to be plenty of people, the isolationists out there are going to say, absolutely not. Did you learn the lessons of Iraq? Did you learn the lessons of Afghanistan? And again, my answer is I did. And the answers, or the lessons that I learned, was that Iran was responsible for a huge amount of our failure and bloodshed. So let's get rid of the reasons why we failed in those previous iterations where we tried to build something better in the Middle East.
And also they're responsible for a lot of the failure of the regime changes and where those societies went post our involvement, right? So they've been deeply engaged in proliferating the unrest in all of those places where we gave, again, the opportunity for freedom. They came in and were active in undermining all of that.
Yeah. And by the way, another place we haven't even talked about is Lebanon. This is a country that has been essentially under occupation by proxy with Iran, right? The Iranians, through Hezbollah, have absolutely made it so that this government, which, by the way, should be a peaceful, prosperous country. Once upon a time, it was a banking center in the Middle East. They called themselves the Switzerland. Not that Switzerland's a great model for anybody, but, they were the Switzerland of the Middle East, and now they've been suffocated, strangled by the Iranian regime. Just trying to think about the way that this might help if the Iranian regime were no longer able to sponsor terrorism around the region. Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, Lebanon, right? All around the region, not to mention places like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain that have been fighting Shia militias. There's so much potential positive upside. Nothing's guaranteed. There's no guarantees in foreign policy. There's no guarantees in war. But I would say that Iran has been such a source of instability and mayhem that I would welcome the downfall of this regime. Pretty much most plans sight unseen, with caveats, right? We need responsible stakeholders with responsible plans, with execution according to exactly what's been laid out by our intelligence services and the like. But assuming you've got smart people coming up with smart plans that would get rid of this regime, gosh, I dream of that moment. I do.
Truly.
But what about Qatar in all of this?
That's my favorite topic. Qatar is the arsonist and the firefighter. They are a regime that, on the one hand, they've got our largest air base in the Middle East, and it's a deterrent for the Iranian regime and all of these jihadists that we've been fighting all around the world. On the other hand, the Qataris still fund Hamas. They're still a headquarters for Hamas. They funded, and they're a headquarters for the Taliban. They're the primary patron for the Muslim Brotherhood. They have provided safe haven for Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. This, I got to say, this is a country of 330,000 citizens. They control 12% of the world's energy, bottomless wealth, and they have deployed that wealth in ways that has been helpful in some ways to the West, but also incredibly detrimental. I would welcome a significant change by the regime in Doha. If they don't change, I would recommend drastic measures, because I believe that this is a country that is gaining influence in the United States in ways that it shouldn't. The research that we've done at FDD shows that this regime has plowed more than $300 billion into the American economy, and it has bought influence in ways that I don't welcome. We should not allow this tiny terror funding state to have the kind of influence that it has. It's one thing to say, look, if they don't fund terrorism and they're investing in the United States, okay, maybe I'd be okay with that. But if they're investing all that money and they want us to be okay with their sponsorship of the Taliban and the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and and some of the games of footsie they've been playing with the Iranian regime, I got a big problem here. And I don't know how much other people see this problem. I've been probably one of the more outspoken critics of this regime. And they don't like me for it. But you know what? If they don't like me for it, I feel like I'm doing something right.
That's right.
Yeah. And not to mention their, horrible injustices that they commit to, the over 80% of the population, not citizens, but population of Qatar, which are migrant workers held in the worst conditions, really criticized even by as corrupt organizations as the UN, can't turn a blind eye to the fact, to the oppression of these minorities, really equating it to slavery, modern day slavery. And, so even just from a value system perspective, the level of injustice there for such a wealthy nation that restricts that wealth to one ruling class in an autocracy, keeps it from the workers that, help make the wealth and then use it to undermine our society here in the West. They use that wealth to buy up influence, as you've said, undermining everything. The absolute injustice of it all, I'm with you in calling them out as often as we can, and even, always calling out Tucker Carlson, who loves Qatar and just bought a home in Doha, so that he can be neighbors with all of the regimes that you just mentioned. I find that to be despicable, and then actually has the audacity to gaslight the American people and say that he's doing it because he's a true American and he can do whatever he wants. And, that is literally, in my opinion, the opposite of what it means to be an actual American and have, Western values.
Just one correction.
Yeah.
It was a pronunciation problem. It's pronounced Qatarlson.
Tucker Qatarlson. Well, there you have it. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for taking the time to meet with us. I really think you've shed a lot of light on this and really appreciative for that. Where can people get your books? I know you've written books about many different topics in the Middle East, many different countries and regimes and so on and so forth, the conflicts, the difference between Hamas and the PA and so on and so forth. Where can people have access to those?
Well, Amazon.com is always the easiest. Some of the, at least one of them, Hamas versus Fatah, the struggle for Palestine, is probably the book that kind of sheds the most light on a conflict that most people aren't aware of. There's literally a civil war that's still ongoing inside the Palestinian political structure. But all those are available. Usually that one you have to buy used just because it's now out of print. But maybe we'll get a second, a second version going. But you can also,
I hope so.
Yeah,
People
me
need
too.
to know.
But you can find me on X at @Schanzer, on Instagram at Jonathan.Schanzer. And for sure, folks can find all the work that we do at FDD.org, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD.org.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, folks, if you like what you heard today, a couple things. One, take our word for it. Go out and look into all these things for yourself. Ask yourself these hard questions. Hit that like button, subscribe, and thank you for tracking with us.